Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back nearly 2,000 years to a world of dusty roads, clanking armor, smoky campfires, and one very persistent question. What did ancient Roman soldiers actually eat every single day? Now, if you're picturing endless feasts with roasted pigs, mountains of grapes, and servants constantly refilling golden goblets, you may want to gently set those expectations aside. Those luxurious banquets certainly existed somewhere, usually inside the homes of senators who considered walking to another room a remarkable athletic achievement. The average Roman legionary had a rather different experience. So tonight, dim the lights, settle into your blanket, perhaps fluff your pillow just a little, and let your mind wander through the slow rhythm of military life. We'll follow ordinary soldiers as they march across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, discovering what they cooked, how they carried their food, why bread mattered more than almost anything else, and why one sack of wheat could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Nothing too exciting, just thousands of men eating an astonishing amount of grain, which, if we're being honest, sounds surprisingly relaxing. Imagine waking before sunrise somewhere along the Rhine frontier. The air is cool. Mist hangs over the nearby river. Hundreds of leather tents stand in perfect rows because Romans adored straight lines with almost religious enthusiasm. Somewhere a mule complains loudly about existing. A centurion is already shouting at someone, probably everyone. The camp slowly begins to wake. Armor creaks, boots scrape across packed earth. Small cooking fires begin to glow orange against the fading darkness. And before any drills begin, before roads are built, before forts are repaired, before anyone marches 20 miles carrying equipment heavy enough to make modern hikers quietly reconsider their life choices, breakfast comes first. Not because Rome believed in luxury, because hungry soldiers are terrible soldiers. This was a lesson armies kept learning over and over throughout history. Naturally, they usually learned it the hard way. For the Roman army, food wasn't simply comfort. Food was strategy. Entire military campaigns depended less on brilliant generals and more on whether enough grain arrived at the right place on the right day. Julius Caesar himself once admitted that armies marched on supplies just as much as courage. Actually, perhaps even more than courage. Bravery doesn't bake bread. Wheat does. The backbone of every Roman soldier's diet was grain, mostly wheat, sometimes barley, occasionally other cereals if circumstances became unfortunate. Each soldier often received an allocation of raw grain rather than ready-made bread. This surprises many people today. Why not simply hand everyone fresh loaves? Because fresh bread spoils. Flour lasts longer. Whole grain lasts even longer. And perhaps most importantly, Roman soldiers were expected to cook. Yes, these heavily armed professional warriors also spent part of their evenings grinding wheat. History often leaves out these wonderfully ordinary moments. 1 minute, a man is defending the northern frontier of an empire stretching across 3 continents. The next minute, he's arguing with his friend over whose turn it is to grind grain. Empires, it turns out, are surprisingly domestic. Grinding grain was exhausting. A small hand mill consisted of 2 heavy stones. Grain went in at the top. 1 stone slowly rotated against the other. Out came coarse flour, hour after hour, day after day. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting. It certainly wasn't quick. But everyone ate because someone kept turning that stone. Roman military life contained countless little tasks like this. History often remembers spectacular battles. The soldiers mostly remembered sore backs. Once enough flour had been prepared, several possibilities appeared. The simplest was flatbread, water, flour, perhaps a little salt, mixed together, flattened, cooked over hot stones or inside simple ovens. No elaborate recipes, no decorative herbs arranged artistically across the surface, just dependable calories, thousands of them. Roman armies loved dependable things, dependable roads, dependable formations, dependable commanders. Well, at least they hoped for dependable commanders. Reality occasionally disagreed. Bread quickly became almost sacred inside Roman military culture. Without bread, everything became more difficult. Marching became harder. Morale slipped. Discipline weakened. Complaints multiplied. Human nature has remained remarkably consistent over 2,000 years. Take away someone's carbohydrates, and civilization begins to wobble ever so slightly. Interestingly, Roman soldiers often baked together. Small groups known as contubernia usually consisted of 8 men. These 8 soldiers shared one leather tent. They shared equipment. They shared cooking duties. They shared endless conversations after long marches. And undoubtedly, they shared opinions about whichever member consistently burned dinner. Every group has one. History politely refuses to record his name. The contubernium functioned almost like a family, perhaps not an especially peaceful family. After all, 8 tired men living inside one tent for years at a time would inevitably produce disagreements. Someone snored. Someone forgot firewood. Someone borrowed a knife and somehow misplaced it forever. Someone definitely insisted he could cook better than everyone else. He almost certainly couldn't. Yet together they survived. Together they cooked. Together they marched. Together they fought. And often, together they grew old, or at least older than statistics suggested. Of course, grain alone would become rather monotonous. Imagine eating bread every single day, morning, noon, evening, week after week, month after month, year after year. Eventually, even the most enthusiastic baker might quietly dream about vegetables. Fortunately, vegetables existed. Roman soldiers regularly consumed beans, lentils, peas, onions, garlic, cabbage, turnips, leeks. These foods traveled reasonably well and could survive military supply systems without becoming complete disasters. Garlic became particularly popular, whether soldiers genuinely loved its flavor or simply appreciated that everyone smelled equally terrible afterward. History leaves delightfully uncertain. Then came olive oil. To modern Mediterranean cooking, olive oil hardly seems remarkable. To Roman soldiers, it was invaluable. It added flavor, calories, nutrition. It preserved food. It traveled surprisingly well inside sealed containers. One could drizzle it over vegetables, mix it into porridge, dip bread into it, or simply appreciate that today's meal wasn't completely dry. Tiny victories matter, especially after marching 20 miles wearing armor. Cheese also appeared frequently. Hard cheeses survived journeys better than softer varieties. They stored well, provided protein, required little preparation. A soldier could easily carry pieces inside his pack while marching, not elegant dining, but practical. Roman civilization admired practicality almost as much as conquest, sometimes more. Conquering territory was impressive. Successfully feeding 50,000 hungry soldiers. That was administrative genius, and Rome quietly excelled at administration, at least most days. Meat occupied an interesting position. Modern imagination often pictures ancient warriors endlessly roasting enormous joints of beef. Reality was gentler. Meat certainly appeared, but not necessarily every day. Pork proved especially common. Salted bacon traveled well. Ham remained popular. Occasionally beef, sometimes goat, sometimes mutton, depending on location and supply. Fresh meat usually appeared after successful hunts, local purchases, or official distributions. Otherwise, Salt-preserved meat patiently waited inside storage containers, looking somewhat less inspiring than freshly roasted feasts depicted in paintings. Paintings rarely celebrate salted pork, perhaps unfairly. Fish also mattered, especially near rivers or coastlines. Salted fish traveled across enormous distances. Fish sauce called garum appeared almost everywhere throughout Roman society. Yes, fish sauce, made by fermenting fish for months, sometimes under the warm Mediterranean sun. Exactly as fragrant as that description suggests. Romans absolutely adored it. They poured it over countless dishes. Today, many people wrinkle their noses at the idea. Yet future civilizations may eventually judge some of our favorite condiments with equal confusion. History has a wonderful sense of perspective. Water, naturally, remained essential. Yet surprisingly, Romans often worried about drinking plain water from uncertain sources. Contaminated water could quietly destroy armies. Instead, soldiers frequently drank a diluted mixture of water and sour wine called posca. It wasn't luxurious. It certainly wouldn't impress modern sommeliers, but the vinegar helped preserve the drink, masked unpleasant flavors, and made questionable water somewhat safer. Refreshing, perhaps not. Reliable, usually. Again, Rome admired reliability. As morning slowly brightened across the camp, breakfast ended. Cooking equipment was cleaned, fires reduced, supplies packed, orders shouted, standards lifted, thousands of boots prepared to move together. The soldiers had eaten enough to begin another demanding day, not extravagantly, simply sufficiently. Sometimes that's all history required, not glorious feasts, just enough bread to keep walking. And Rome became astonishingly good at making sure its soldiers kept walking for centuries, slowly, steadily, one loaf at a time. The marching usually began not long after breakfast. There was very little ceremony about it, no dramatic speeches, no triumphant music echoing across the hills, just thousands of people adjusting straps, lifting shields that somehow felt heavier every morning, and quietly accepting that another 20 or so miles awaited them. Roman soldiers became experts at carrying things, not just swords and shields. Those were only the beginning. A typical legionary hauled cooking pots, wooden stakes for building camp defenses, spare clothing, blankets, tools, personal belongings, grain rations, and whatever else the army considered absolutely essential that week. By the end of the first hour, nearly everyone was sweating. By lunchtime, everyone definitely was. which made food even more important. Calories were not an optional luxury, they were fuel. Modern athletes carefully count carbohydrates before endurance events. Roman soldiers simply shouldered a sack of wheat and hoped the quartermaster had done his job properly. Usually, he had, when he hadn't. Entire military campaigns became remarkably unpleasant. Roman commanders understood something that still holds true today. A tired soldier can keep marching, a wet soldier can keep marching, even a cold soldier can keep marching for a while. A hungry soldier, however, becomes increasingly interested in complaining. The Roman army had many talents. Listening patiently to complaints was not among them. So enormous effort went into making sure supplies kept arriving. Long before a legion reached a frontier, officials had already begun arranging grain deliveries. Merchants signed contracts, storehouses filled, river barges drifted slowly downstream, ox carts creaked along dusty roads. Thousands of ordinary workers became invisible partners in every Roman victory. History usually remembers the general standing dramatically on a hill. It rarely remembers the farmer who harvested the wheat 6 months earlier. Yet without that farmer, the general would have had very little to stand on besides disappointment. Roman supply depots were remarkable places. Imagine vast warehouses stacked with sacks of grain, amphorae filled with olive oil, barrels of wine, bundles of dried vegetables, salted meat hanging from wooden beams, everything carefully counted, everything carefully recorded. The Romans adored records. If they could write something down, they almost certainly did. How much grain entered the warehouse, how much left, who received it, who signed for it, who was responsible if it mysteriously disappeared. Because grain has an astonishing habit of wandering away whenever supervision becomes too relaxed. Human nature has also remained wonderfully consistent. Some forts even had enormous granaries raised above the ground on stone supports. This clever design allowed air to circulate beneath the floor. It helped keep grain dry. It discouraged dampness. It also made life considerably harder for rats. Not impossible, just harder. Rats have always approached human engineering as more of a suggestion than an obstacle. Still, every little advantage helped. A spoiled grain supply could become disastrous, not merely inconvenient, disastrous. The Roman army planned for the future with impressive determination. Soldiers often carried several days' worth of food themselves. Additional supplies followed behind. If roads became blocked or rivers flooded, reserve stores might prevent catastrophe. This required constant organization. Someone always counted sacks. Someone always inspected supplies. Someone always worried there wasn't enough. That someone was usually correct to worry. Empires are surprisingly fragile once the bread runs out. As the sun climbed higher, the legion eventually paused, not for a luxurious picnic, simply for enough time to catch their breath. Perhaps drink some posca, maybe chew a little bread with cheese or dried meat. Lunch tended to be practical rather than memorable. No one unfolded embroidered tablecloths. No one debated which vintage paired best with salted bacon. The menu rarely inspired poetry. It inspired continued movement, which was exactly the point. Roman soldiers learned to appreciate simple pleasures, a fresh loaf instead of a stale one, a little extra olive oil, a handful of figs purchased from a nearby village, perhaps some apples in the autumn, maybe walnuts if fortune smiled. These modest treats could brighten an otherwise ordinary day. Luxury, after all, depends largely on expectations. If you've marched for hours beneath the summer sun, a ripe pear can seem almost miraculous. Fruit appeared whenever geography allowed. Grapes, apples, pears, plums, figs, dates in warmer provinces. Some fruits were eaten fresh, others were dried for storage. Dried figs became especially useful, compact, sweet, full of energy, easy to carry. Roman soldiers may not have discussed nutritional science, but experience taught them what worked. A handful of dried fruit could provide welcome strength during a long march. Nuts served a similar purpose. Walnuts, hazelnuts, almonds in some regions, chestnuts where they grew, easy to transport, slow to spoil, simple to eat while walking. One can almost picture a weary legionary absent-mindedly cracking walnuts as the column stretched across another dusty Roman road. Even history's most disciplined armies occasionally enjoyed a quiet snack. The roads themselves deserve a brief moment of appreciation. Roman roads became legendary, straight, solid, carefully engineered. Many survived for centuries. Some still influence modern routes today. They existed partly because moving food efficiently mattered just as much as moving soldiers. A muddy path might delay grain wagons. A well-built road kept the entire military machine functioning. Rome invested enormous effort into infrastructure. Sometimes conquest looked suspiciously like road construction with occasional interruptions. Of course, weather rarely cooperated. Heavy rain transformed camps into muddy landscapes. Summer heat exhausted both men and animals. Winter froze rivers. Snow buried mountain passes. Yet somehow supplies still had to arrive. Mules struggled onward. Drivers encouraged oxen with remarkable patience. Boatmen watched changing currents. Everyone became part of an immense logistical dance stretching across the empire. Most never appeared in famous history books. Without them, however, there would have been very few famous history books to write. Eventually, as evening approached, the marching stopped, not because everyone felt particularly rested, simply because another task now demanded attention: building the camp. This surprises many people. Roman armies often constructed fortified camps almost every single night, even after walking all day, even when everyone was tired, especially when everyone was tired. First came ditches, then earth walls, then wooden stakes. Only afterward could cooking truly begin. The Romans possessed an almost supernatural commitment to routine. It was exhausting. It was effective. Naturally, they kept doing it. Once the camp stood secure, fires slowly appeared across the neat rows of tents. The atmosphere changed. The sharp rhythm of military discipline softened just a little. Smoke drifted upward. Cooking pots emerged. Someone fetched water. Someone gathered extra firewood. Someone inevitably discovered they'd forgotten something important. Every evening contained small inconveniences. Fortunately, soldiers had become quite skilled at solving them, or borrowing solutions from neighboring tents. Dinner was usually the largest meal of the day. The familiar grain returned once again, only now it might become porridge instead of bread. Romans called one common version pulse. Simple, warm, comforting. Flour or crushed grain simmered slowly with water until it thickened. Olive oil improved it. Herbs improved it further. Vegetables transformed it into something approaching genuine satisfaction. It was not glamorous, but after a full day's march, glamour ranked surprisingly low on the list of priorities. Warm food ranked much higher. If beans were available, they often found their way into the pot. Lentils, too, slowly simmering together, creating hearty stews that filled hungry stomachs. Cooking became almost meditative. The fire crackled softly. Wood smoke drifted through the cool evening air. Conversations became quieter. The day's hardship slowly dissolved into ordinary discussion. Someone mentioned home. Someone complained about blisters. Someone speculated about tomorrow's march. Another insisted tomorrow would certainly be shorter. No one believed him. Occasionally, fortune smiled upon the camp. Perhaps local farmers sold fresh eggs, maybe chickens. Perhaps a hunter returned with rabbits. If stationed near a river, fishermen sometimes enjoyed unusual popularity that evening. Fresh food broke the routine. Even modest variety lifted spirits. The Roman army understood morale surprisingly well. A content soldier generally followed orders more willingly than a miserable one. Not always, but often enough to matter. There were, of course, times when food became scarce. Campaigns did not always unfold according to careful plans. Enemy forces destroyed crops, supply wagons disappeared, unexpected storms delayed shipments. Sometimes soldiers had to rely on barley instead of wheat. Interestingly, barley carried a certain stigma. It was considered slightly inferior. In some cases, commanders even issued barley as punishment instead of wheat. Imagine being disciplined through carbohydrates. History occasionally develops wonderfully specific forms of disappointment. As darkness settled across the camp, the fires slowly burned lower. Cooking pots emptied, bread disappeared. The final cups of diluted wine or posca were shared among friends. Some men repaired sandals, others sharpened tools. A few quietly wrote letters if they had the education to do so. Many simply stared into the glowing embers. Tomorrow would likely resemble today. Another march, another camp, another loaf of bread, another bowl of porridge. The rhythm rarely changed. Perhaps that was part of Rome's strength. Victory was often less about dramatic heroics and more about repeating ordinary tasks with extraordinary consistency. Day after day, year after year, one meal after another. And as the camp gradually fell silent beneath a blanket of stars, thousands of well-fed soldiers drifted towards sleep, knowing that before sunrise, someone would once again light the cooking fires, and another ordinary Roman day would quietly begin. Morning returned with remarkable reliability. The sun had not yet climbed above the horizon. A cool mist rested over the camp. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster announced the new day with complete confidence, despite no one having asked for its opinion. The first cooking fires flickered back to life. Smoke curled lazily into the pale sky. A few sleepy soldiers stretched aching shoulders. Others quietly searched for their sandals. Someone had inevitably misplaced one. Military discipline could accomplish many things. Keeping track of every sandal was apparently not among them. The camp slowly awakened through familiar routines. Nothing happened quickly. Everything happened steadily. Roman armies preferred habits over surprises. Every morning followed a pattern that had been repeated thousands of times before. Wake, prepare food, pack equipment, receive orders. March, repeat tomorrow, repeat again next week. Continue for several years. There was something strangely comforting about its predictability. Unless, of course, you happen to be the one carrying the heaviest pack. The average Roman legionary needed an enormous amount of energy. Historians estimate that a soldier on campaign could burn well over 4,000 calories in a single day. Some days, even more. Building roads, digging ditches, constructing bridges, carrying equipment, marching 20 miles, swinging tools that often weighed nearly as much as modern gym equipment, except no one applauded afterward. Instead, someone usually handed you another shovel. Rome was exceptionally generous with manual labor. Because soldiers needed so much energy, grain remained the foundation of everything. Today, many people imagine protein as the centerpiece of every athletic diet. Roman thinking was rather different. Bread came first, almost always. Without bread, strength faded surprisingly quickly. Without grain, armies simply stopped moving, and Rome disliked stopping. The empire preferred to keep expanding, or at the very least, to continue arguing with whichever neighboring tribe had become inconvenient that season. Interestingly, Roman soldiers were expected to be surprisingly self-sufficient. A new recruit quickly learned that military life involved far more than fighting. He had to cook, he had to repair clothing, he had to maintain weapons, he had to care for his sandals, he had to help build camps, he had to clean equipment, he even had to keep his personal cooking utensils in good condition. No servants followed ordinary legionaries around polishing spoons. If your cooking pot became damaged, congratulations. You now had the exciting opportunity to fix it yourself. Each contubernium, those small groups of 8 soldiers sharing one tent, usually owned cooking equipment together. A pot, perhaps a frying pan, wooden bowls, simple knives, grinding stones. Nothing luxurious, everything practical. The equipment became almost as familiar as the soldiers themselves. Over time, the handles darkened from smoke. The metal carried scratches from countless meals. Every dent probably had its own story, none of them especially dramatic, most likely involving someone dropping dinner. History is wonderfully ordinary when you look closely enough. Roman recipes were generally uncomplicated. Fresh herbs occasionally added flavor: parsley, coriander, dill, fennel, mint, if they happened to be available. Spices from distant lands certainly existed. Pepper traveled all the way from India. Cinnamon arrived through long trading networks, but these precious imports usually belonged on wealthy tables. The ordinary soldier rarely sprinkled expensive pepper over his evening porridge. The quartermaster would probably have fainted. Salt, however, mattered enormously, not simply for flavor, for preservation. Long before refrigeration, salt quietly became one of civilization's greatest inventions. Meat lasted longer. Fish survived long journeys. Vegetables could be preserved. Without salt, military logistics would have become vastly more complicated. Entire empires have quietly depended upon remarkably simple minerals. Sometimes history's greatest heroes are disappointingly unglamorous. A sack of salt rarely receives its own statue. Perhaps it deserves one. Speaking of preservation, Roman soldiers became remarkably familiar with dried foods. Fresh vegetables were delightful. Dried vegetables were dependable. Dependability usually won. Beans could survive for months. Lentils even longer. Dried fruit traveled extraordinary distances. Everything had to survive heat, rain, dust, occasional accidents involving mules. The Roman supply system planned for nearly everything. The mules, however, occasionally introduced creative complications. Roman mules deserve a brief moment of appreciation. Thousands upon thousands served the empire faithfully. They hauled grain, olive oil, weapons, tools, cooking equipment, medical supplies, sometimes officers, though the officers generally preferred horses whenever possible. The mules likely considered this perfectly acceptable. They already had enough work. One imagines they developed rather strong opinions about Roman military expansion. History rarely recorded them. Whenever the army remained in one place for several weeks, food improved noticeably. Permanent forts often developed lively communities nearby. Merchants arrived. Farmers sold produce. Bakers opened small shops. Butchers established businesses. Soon the soldiers had access to far more variety. Fresh bread appeared more often. Eggs became easier to obtain. Milk occasionally reached the camp before spoiling. Simple luxuries gradually returned. Civilization has always followed armies almost as faithfully as tax collectors, sometimes even more faithfully. Many frontier forts slowly grew into thriving towns. Families settled nearby. Craftsmen established workshops. Blacksmiths repaired equipment. Potters made cooking vessels. Children played in streets that hadn't existed a few years earlier. Markets bustled with activity. The Roman army didn't simply defend borders. Quite accidentally, it often created entirely new communities. One loaf of bread at a time. Soldiers occasionally purchased extra food with their wages. Roman pay was respectable by ancient standards, though deductions appeared with remarkable enthusiasm. Clothing, equipment, food, various expenses. The government seemed endlessly inventive when calculating deductions. One suspects that ancient soldiers sighed whenever payday arrived. Some traditions apparently survive every century. Even so, many soldiers managed to save money. Some retired comfortably after long service. Others invested in farms. Many married local women after completing their military careers. The disciplined habits learned around campfires often continued throughout civilian life. After 20 years of measuring grain carefully, wasting food probably seemed almost impossible. Old routines have a way of lingering. Not every meal tasted wonderful. Some days the bread burned, other days the porridge became suspiciously watery. Occasionally the meat was tougher than anyone appreciated. Cooking over open fires invited inconsistency. Wind changed direction. Rain arrived unexpectedly. Firewood burned unevenly. The chef, who was simply whichever soldier drew the short straw that evening, did his best. Results varied. Friendship occasionally required polite silence during dinner. Yet shared meals mattered for reasons beyond nutrition. They created routine, conversation, trust. 8 men sitting around one small fire slowly became more than strangers wearing identical armor. They learned each other's stories. One had grown up on a vineyard. Another came from a fishing village. Someone else had never seen the sea before joining the army. Another quietly missed his mother's cooking every single day. He probably wasn't alone. No matter how competent the camp cooks became, mothers throughout history have enjoyed an unfair advantage. Letters from home occasionally arrived, not often, but often enough to brighten an ordinary evening. Perhaps news of a new child, perhaps a successful harvest, perhaps unfortunate family arguments that somehow continued despite hundreds of miles of separation. Families possess a remarkable ability to remain complicated regardless of geography. A soldier might read the letter several times, then carefully fold it away beside his few precious belongings. Tomorrow would bring another march, but tonight, for a little while, home felt slightly closer. As darkness settled once more over the camp, the familiar smells returned: wood smoke, fresh bread, boiling lentils, olive oil warming gently in an iron pot. Simple aromas, comforting aromas, the sort that quietly told tired men they had reached the end of another long day. The empire stretched across continents. Its politics could become astonishingly complicated. Its emperors occasionally behaved in ways that left historians gently rubbing their temples. But here, around hundreds of small campfires, life remained surprisingly simple. Eat, rest, share a few quiet words, sleep, wake before dawn, and begin again. For the Roman soldier, history was rarely lived through grand speeches or glorious celebrations. More often, it was lived one modest meal at a time, with a loaf of coarse bread in one hand, a wooden bowl in the other, and tomorrow's march already waiting just beyond the sunrise. By now, several weeks may have passed. Not for us, comfortably tucked beneath blankets, but for the legion marching steadily across another corner of the Roman world. The scenery changes almost imperceptibly. The forests become thinner, the hills soften. Perhaps the air carries the scent of the Mediterranean once again. Or perhaps it grows colder as the road winds north toward Britain, where sunshine occasionally appeared simply to remind everyone that it still existed somewhere. The soldiers notice these changes, mostly because different landscapes mean different food. Rome ruled an enormous empire, from the misty shores of Britain to the warm deserts of Egypt, from the mountains of Spain to the fertile plains of Syria. Every province produced its own crops. Every region had its own habits. Naturally, Roman soldiers became enthusiastic borrowers when it came to food. If something tasted good, lasted well, and kept an army marching, they were happy to adopt it. Empires have always been excellent collectors of recipes, sometimes far better than they were at collecting peace. Imagine a legion stationed in Egypt. The mornings feel warmer, the sunlight arrives with astonishing confidence. Nearby fields produce wheat unlike almost anywhere else in the empire. The Nile floods each year, quietly spreading rich soil across the countryside. For thousands of years before Rome arrived, Egyptian farmers had mastered the rhythm of this remarkable river. The Romans, being practical people, looked at this incredibly productive farmland and thought, yes, we'd very much like this to help feed our empire. And so it did. Enormous shipments of Egyptian grain crossed the Mediterranean every year. Much of Rome itself depended upon these harvests. An emperor could survive many political arguments. Interrupt the grain supply, however, that became everyone's problem very quickly. Now drift north instead, far beyond the sunny vineyards of Italy, to Britain. Life feels different here. The weather seems permanently undecided. Rain arrives with astonishing enthusiasm. The roads become muddy. Boots remain damp for suspiciously long periods. Roman soldiers stationed here adapted as best they could. Local cattle provided beef. Nearby rivers supplied fish. Native farmers introduced different vegetables and grains. The menu changed gently with the landscape, although the weather continued, refusing to cooperate. Some traditions are simply timeless. Roman soldiers also discovered new fruits and herbs wherever they traveled. Not every experiment succeeded. Some plants tasted wonderful. Others inspired expressions historians were polite enough not to record. Trying unfamiliar food required a certain bravery, perhaps not quite the same bravery required during battle, but bravery nonetheless. Someone always had to taste it first. One imagines the youngest soldier occasionally finding himself volunteered with suspicious frequency. Markets became welcome destinations whenever the opportunity arose. A bustling provincial market offered small luxuries unavailable through military rations: fresh apples, honey, soft cheese, warm bread baked that very morning, perhaps even pastries. Simple pleasures, certainly, but after weeks of military routine, they must have seemed wonderfully extravagant. A soldier strolling through a market probably looked rather ordinary, helmet tucked under one arm, coin purse carefully guarded, quietly deciding whether figs were worth today's wages. History spends surprisingly little time discussing grocery shopping, yet everyone eventually needs dinner, even conquerors. Honey deserves special attention. The Romans absolutely adored it. Without refined sugar, honey became the empire's favorite sweetener. It flavored bread, cakes, sauces, wine, medicine, almost everything really. Beekeeping was respected work. Roman cooks found endless uses for honey. Soldiers appreciated any opportunity to break the steady procession of bread and porridge with something pleasantly sweet. Even a spoonful could transform an ordinary meal. Tiny comforts often carry remarkable importance, especially when ordinary days stretch endlessly into one another. Speaking of ordinary days, not every soldier spent his entire career marching. Many remained inside permanent forts for years. Life there followed its own quiet rhythm. Morning inspections, weapon maintenance, training, guard duty, repairing walls, cleaning streets, cooking, always cooking. An army never truly escaped the kitchen. Even the greatest military machine in the ancient world eventually paused to prepare supper. Perhaps civilization itself is simply one long interruption between meals. Training burned astonishing amounts of energy. Roman instructors believed strongly in practice. Then more practice, followed by additional practice, just to ensure no one had accidentally become comfortable. Soldiers marched carrying full equipment. They sparred with wooden swords heavier than real ones. They threw spears repeatedly. They dug trenches, built walls, ran obstacle courses. The philosophy seemed wonderfully straightforward. If training feels harder than battle, battle might seem slightly easier, or at least slightly less surprising. After such exhausting work, appetites grew impressive. Imagine 8 soldiers returning to their tent after a full day of drills. No elaborate menu planning, no debates over fashionable diets, no concern about avoiding carbohydrates. Quite the opposite. The bread disappeared quickly, the stew followed. Someone reached for another onion. Another poured olive oil onto a fresh loaf. Within minutes, Dinner had become little more than satisfied silence. Sometimes the best compliment a cook receives is an empty pot. Occasionally, celebrations interrupted routine, a military victory, an emperor's birthday, a religious festival. These events often meant improved food, extra meat, better wine, freshly baked cakes, perhaps roasted pork shared among the unit. The atmosphere relaxed, laughter became more common, musicians occasionally appeared. Stories grew slightly more exaggerated with every cup of wine. Naturally, human beings have always possessed a remarkable talent for improving their own adventures in retrospect, especially after dinner. Wine itself played an interesting role in Roman life. Unlike modern habits, Roman wine was usually diluted with water. Drinking it undiluted was often considered rather uncivilized. Strong wine mixed with water became part of everyday life. For soldiers, however, Posca often remained the more practical choice during campaigns. Cheap, refreshing enough, unlikely to spoil quickly, it lacked elegance. The Roman army generally valued usefulness over elegance, except perhaps during triumphal parades. Those were allowed a little theatrical flair. Religion quietly accompanied many meals. Roman soldiers worshipped numerous gods. Before eating, simple offerings or prayers sometimes acknowledged divine protection, not elaborate ceremonies, just small moments of gratitude. Perhaps a crumb of bread, perhaps a whispered request for tomorrow's march to remain uneventful. The gods received many such requests. Whether they answered consistently remains open to interpretation. Ancient historians occasionally sounded rather unconvinced themselves. Night settled over the fort. Torches flickered along stone walls. Guards paced slowly atop the ramparts. Inside the barracks, conversations gradually faded. Cooking fires glowed softly before shrinking into warm embers. Tomorrow would almost certainly resemble today. More drills, more bread, more repairs, more careful attention to sandals. One cannot overstate the importance of good sandals in the Roman army. Entire military careers quietly depended upon healthy feet. Great generals receive statues. Reliable footwear receives very little appreciation. History can be surprisingly unfair. Some soldiers, lying awake before sleep finally arrived, probably wondered what awaited them after their service ended. A small farm, perhaps, a family, children who would never need to carry armor across mountains, a quiet life. Many eventually achieved exactly that. Their military years became stories told beside ordinary fireplaces instead of military campfires. The recipes they learned while serving traveled home with them. The habit of baking bread, making simple stews, preserving vegetables, Cooking became one of the many invisible ways the Roman army shaped everyday life across the empire. Empires leave behind roads. Another dawn arrives, not dramatically. The Roman Empire was many things, but it rarely paused for dramatic sunrises. Instead, the first light slowly spills across the camp, revealing rows of leather tents damp with morning dew. A thin layer of mist clings to the ground, and somewhere nearby a cook is already coaxing yesterday's embers back into a respectable fire. The camp wakes the same way it always has. Someone yawns, someone sneezes. Someone discovers that sleeping on the ground has once again failed to become comfortable. It is a disappointment repeated thousands of mornings across the empire. One imagines expectations eventually became quite modest. Before breakfast can begin, one task comes first: fetching water. Clean water, if possible. Roman soldiers understood that water mattered almost as much as bread. Not because they knew about bacteria or microscopic organisms. Those discoveries lay nearly 2,000 years in the future. But experience had taught them a simpler lesson. Drink from the wrong stream, and the next few days might become deeply unpleasant. Entire units had learned this through painful experience. Human history often advances by making the same mistake repeatedly until someone finally decides to stop. Water parties left camp carrying wooden buckets and leather skins. Sometimes they walked only a few hundred meters. Other times, much farther. If a spring was nearby, everyone considered themselves fortunate. Fresh spring water earned quiet appreciation. No speeches, no celebrations, just grateful soldiers filling containers before heading back. Simple blessings rarely announce themselves with great fanfare. Once the water returned, breakfast preparations truly began. Grinding grain, as always, remained the first challenge. The familiar hand mill appeared once again. Stone against stone, a slow, steady rhythm. The sound became almost part of military life itself. Scrape, turn, scrape, turn. Not exciting, not memorable, yet strangely comforting in its consistency. Some sounds become so familiar that their absence feels unusual. While one soldier worked the mill, another mixed flour with water. Someone else tended the fire. Without discussing it much, everyone settled into their usual roles. Years of living together created quiet efficiency. There was no need for complicated instructions. Each man already knew what needed doing. Shared routines have a way of becoming almost invisible. Breakfast might include yesterday's bread if any remained. Romans disliked wasting food. Fresh loaves were wonderful. Slightly stale ones were perfectly acceptable. Very stale bread could be softened with water, olive oil, or soup. Resourcefulness mattered more than elegance. No one expected restaurant-quality dining while stationed along the Danube frontier. Expectations, once again, remained refreshingly realistic. The Roman army also issued vinegar as part of its supplies, not merely for Posca. Vinegar served countless purposes: cleaning, preserving food, flavoring vegetables, even helping soften hard bread. A humble ingredient, perhaps, yet one that quietly appeared almost everywhere. Ancient kitchens often relied upon a surprisingly small collection of dependable staples: olive oil, salt, vinegar, grain. Add patience, apply heat. Dinner eventually appears. Sometimes soldiers gathered edible plants during marches, wild herbs, blackberries, hazelnuts, mushrooms, if someone knowledgeable identified them. This required caution. Roman soldiers preferred conquering enemies to accidentally poisoning themselves with suspicious fungi. The empire had enough problems without edible mushrooms introducing additional complications. Wisdom often came from older soldiers. Someone always knew which berries were safe. Someone else confidently claimed to know. The two were not necessarily the same person. Fishing became another welcome pastime whenever circumstances allowed. Not elaborate expeditions, simply dropping lines into nearby rivers while off duty. Fresh fish added welcome variety. The fortunate fisherman usually became rather popular that evening, at least until someone else pointed out he still had to clean them. Every pleasant surprise carried a small amount of extra work. Life has always negotiated this arrangement. Roman forts occasionally maintained small gardens, nothing extravagant, just practical patches of vegetables growing inside secure walls. Cabbages, leeks, onions, beans, fresh herbs. The gardens supplemented official rations and brightened meals considerably. It is oddly comforting to imagine hardened legionaries carefully tending vegetables between military duties. History often separates soldiers and gardeners. The Romans quietly combined both occupations. Some forts even kept chickens. The birds provided eggs, occasionally meat, and presumably the same cheerful determination to wake everyone far too early. Certain traditions transcend civilizations. Roosters appear remarkably committed to punctuality. Whether anyone appreciates their enthusiasm is another matter entirely. Life became easier during harvest season. Fields surrounding Roman settlements overflowed with activity. Golden wheat swayed gently beneath the late summer sun. Farmers worked from dawn until evening. Children gathered fallen stalks. Oxen pulled heavy wagons toward overflowing granaries. The entire empire seemed to breathe a quiet sigh of relief. Another harvest meant another year of bread. No wonder grain occupied such an important place in Roman thinking. Without successful harvests, everything else became secondary. Politics, military victories, public festivals, all depended, in one way or another, upon healthy fields. The soldiers understood this better than anyone. Many had grown up on farms before joining the army. The smell of freshly cut wheat reminded them of childhood, of parents, brothers and sisters, village festivals, simple homes far away. Even the toughest veteran occasionally found himself thinking about home while watching farmers work. Memory has a habit of arriving unexpectedly, sometimes carried by nothing more complicated than the scent of warm bread. Evening approached once again. The camp settled into its familiar rhythm. Pots simmered quietly over open flames. The day's bread baked slowly beside glowing coals. A few soldiers repaired torn cloaks. Others polished helmets until they reflected the flickering firelight. Someone quietly carved a small wooden toy, perhaps intended for a child he had not seen in years. The empire often feels enormous in history books, yet moments like these remind us that it was built by ordinary people carrying ordinary hopes. The conversations around the fire remained gentle. News traveled slowly. Rumors traveled remarkably quickly. Someone claimed the emperor planned another campaign. Someone else insisted taxes would soon increase. Another declared with complete confidence that he knew exactly what was happening in Rome. He almost certainly did not. Speculation has always flourished wherever reliable information becomes scarce. The Roman army was no exception. Eventually, conversation faded into comfortable silence. Only the sounds of crackling wood remained. A horse shifted nearby. An owl called somewhere beyond the camp walls. The stars slowly emerged overhead, one after another. The same stars watched over Italy, Gaul, Britain, Egypt, Syria. An empire connected not only by roads and grain ships, but by countless small campfires where tired soldiers finished another simple meal before drifting toward sleep. Tomorrow there would be more bread to bake, more grain to grind, more miles to march. Nothing extraordinary, just another quiet day in the life of a Roman soldier. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary thing of all. For nearly 5 centuries, the Roman army sustained itself not through endless feasts or legendary banquets, but through humble loaves of bread, warm bowls of porridge, shared cooking fires, and the quiet discipline of thousands of ordinary people doing ordinary work, one peaceful meal at a time. As the seasons slowly turned, the food changed with them, not dramatically. The Roman Empire did not reinvent its menu every few months, but the rhythm of nature quietly found its way into every military camp. Spring brought tender greens, summer offered fresh fruit. Autumn filled granaries until they bulged with newly harvested wheat. Winter encouraged everyone to become deeply appreciative of anything warm served in a bowl. Some things never change. Winter on the frontier could be surprisingly unforgiving. Imagine a fort standing beside the Rhine. The trees are bare, a sharp wind slips through every tiny gap in the wooden walls. The river moves slowly beneath a sheet of grey sky. Even the crows seem less enthusiastic than usual. The soldiers wrap their wool cloaks a little tighter. Morning begins exactly as always. Only now every task takes slightly longer because cold fingers are remarkably uncooperative. Grinding grain in freezing weather feels considerably less romantic than history books sometimes suggest. Not that anyone had previously described it as romantic. The camp kitchens become the most welcoming places in the fort. The fires burn almost continuously. Cooking pots bubble gently throughout the day. Steam rises into the cold air. The smell of fresh bread drifts between the barracks. For a few moments, everyone forgets the icy wind waiting just outside. Warm food possesses a quiet magic. It asks for nothing except patience. Stews become increasingly common during colder months. Beans simmer for hours. Lentils soften slowly. Pieces of salted pork release their flavor into the broth. Leeks and onions dissolve almost completely, leaving behind only sweetness. No one rushes the cooking. The longer it sits above the fire, the better it becomes. The Romans may not have invented slow cooking. They certainly perfected the art of appreciating it. The oldest soldiers often became the unofficial experts, not because they held higher rank, simply because experience quietly earns respect. They knew exactly how much water the porridge required. They understood how to keep bread from burning. They could judge a fire almost without looking. Young recruits watched carefully. One day, they too would become the experienced veterans, explaining why someone had once again added far too much water to the stew. Military traditions often begin in surprisingly ordinary kitchens. Of course, food occasionally became the subject of friendly competition. One contubernium proudly insisted their bread was the finest in the entire legion. The neighboring tent strongly disagreed. Someone claimed their stew recipe had come directly from southern Italy. Another argued that nothing surpassed the cooking back home in Gaul. Every province believed its own food was superior. Some conversations never grow old, even after 2,000 years. The Roman army was astonishingly diverse. Although Latin served as the language of command, the soldiers themselves came from every corner of the empire. An Italian recruit might share a fire with a Spaniard. A man from Gaul might cook beside someone born in North Africa. Nearby sat a recruit from the Balkans. Each carried memories of different family recipes, different farming traditions, different favorite foods. Over time, those traditions quietly blended together. The camp became its own little community, its own traveling village, united less by birthplace than by shared routines and shared meals. Occasionally, merchants arrived outside the fort gates. Their carts carried welcome surprises: fresh honey, smoked sausages, cheeses from distant provinces, olives packed carefully in clay jars, perhaps even a few sweet cakes for anyone willing to spend a little extra. Business was usually brisk. A soldier who had eaten porridge for several weeks did not require much encouragement to purchase something different. Variety has always been a powerful salesman. Some merchants traveled extraordinary distances. A jar of olive oil pressed in southern Spain might eventually find its way to a lonely fort in northern Britain. Wine produced in Gaul could be poured hundreds of miles away along the Danube. Pepper harvested in India might season the meal of a wealthy officer stationed near the Black Sea. The Roman Empire was connected by an astonishing network of roads and sea routes. Food traveled almost as impressively as armies, sometimes even faster. One cannot discuss Roman food without mentioning bread ovens. Whenever a fort became permanent, soldiers often built proper communal ovens. These sturdy structures baked dozens of loaves at once. Compared with cooking over open stones, the results were remarkably consistent. The crust became crisp. The inside remained soft. Fresh bread filled the air with a comforting aroma that must have lifted spirits throughout the camp. Few smells have inspired such universal happiness. Freshly baked bread belongs to a very exclusive club. Not every loaf looked beautiful. Some emerged a little darker than intended. Others leaned in unusual directions. A few probably resembled oddly shaped rocks. Fortunately, hungry soldiers cared far more about taste than appearance. Perfection rarely survives contact with an open fire, nor, for that matter, with 8 impatient men waiting for dinner. Discipline even extended to mealtimes. There was an order to things. Supplies had to be distributed fairly, cooking equipment cleaned afterward, waste kept to a minimum. The Roman army disliked unnecessary disorder. A misplaced shield caused problems. A misplaced sack of grain could cause even bigger ones. Quartermasters became surprisingly protective of their inventories. One suspects they occasionally counted wheat sacks in their dreams. When supplies ran low, careful rationing began. Portions became smaller. Nothing was wasted. Breadcrumbs found their way into soups. Animal bones simmered for hours to produce broth. Vegetable scraps disappeared into stews. Modern people might call it sustainability. Roman soldiers simply called it dinner. Necessity has always been history's greatest chef. The officers generally enjoyed somewhat better meals. This should surprise absolutely no one. Higher-ranking officials often had servants, better wine, more varied dishes, perhaps roasted poultry instead of salted pork, fresh fruit more regularly. Life has always offered certain privileges to those near the top. Still, even officers depended upon the same supply system as everyone else. If the grain failed to arrive, rank became considerably less impressive. An empty stomach pays little attention to military titles. The emperor himself understood this. Whether the ruler was Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, or Marcus Aurelius, maintaining the army's food supply remained among the most important responsibilities of government. Magnificent temples were wonderful. Triumphal arches looked impressive. Statues inspired admiration. None of them could feed a legion. Grain ships, however, quietly accomplished that every single day. Sometimes the least glamorous parts of an empire proved to be the most essential. As evening settled once again over the frontier, snow began to fall, only lightly. Soft flakes drifted silently through the darkening sky. The cooking fires glowed brighter against the gathering night. Inside the barracks, soldiers sat with steaming bowls warming their hands. Outside, the cold world waited patiently. Inside there was bread. There was soup. There were familiar voices exchanging the same old stories. Someone laughed quietly. Someone else yawned. Another reached for one final piece of bread before the loaf disappeared entirely. Tomorrow would bring another day, another routine, another meal. Perhaps that steady rhythm was one of Rome's greatest strengths. Not endless victories, not legendary generals, but thousands of ordinary evenings exactly like this one, where tired people shared simple food, looked into the fire, and found enough comfort to rise before dawn and do it all again. And so, beneath a sky filled with quiet winter stars, the camp gradually fell asleep, while the last embers continued glowing softly, waiting to welcome another Roman morning. By this point, the rhythm of military life has become almost familiar. Wake before dawn, stoke the fire, grind the grain, bake the bread, shoulder the pack, march, build the camp, cook the evening meal, sleep, then begin again. It sounds repetitive because it was. The Roman army succeeded not through endless moments of glory, but through ordinary routines repeated with astonishing discipline. For the average legionary, history rarely felt historic. It mostly felt like another Tuesday. One of the greatest challenges facing any Roman army was distance. The empire stretched for thousands of kilometers. Messages traveled slowly, supplies traveled even more slowly. A loaf of bread could not simply appear because someone wanted one. Everything required planning. Months before a campaign even began, officials were calculating how much grain would be needed, how many wagons, how many mules, how many ships, how many drivers. Someone, somewhere, had probably spent an afternoon arguing over the exact number of sacks required. History often celebrates the emperor. It rarely applauds the accountant. And yet, without the accountant, the emperor's army might have gone hungry. The Roman military loved preparation. If there was a possibility that something might go wrong, someone usually tried to prepare for it. Reserve supplies were hidden inside forts. Granaries were inspected regularly. Storehouses were repaired before winter arrived. Nothing was left entirely to chance. Well, not intentionally. Chance, unfortunately, has always been remarkably independent. Occasionally, disaster struck anyway. A violent storm could sink grain ships crossing the Mediterranean, floods washed away roads, bandits attacked supply wagons, enemy forces burned fields before the Romans could harvest them. When this happened, soldiers quickly discovered how valuable their emergency stores really were. No one complained about a full granary until it became an empty one. Then everyone complained. Quite understandably. During long campaigns, soldiers sometimes relied upon local resources. This was called foraging. Groups would spread across the countryside looking for food, fresh vegetables, fruit, livestock, grain purchased from nearby villages whenever possible. The Romans generally preferred buying supplies rather than stealing them, at least when local communities were friendly. A peaceful village often proved far more useful than an angry one. Besides, tomorrow they might need to buy food there again. Burning every bridge quite literally was poor long-term planning. Many local farmers came to know the soldiers quite well. After months or years stationed near the same settlement, familiar faces appeared at the market. The baker recognized certain customers. The cheese seller knew exactly who preferred the strongest flavor. Children watched the soldiers pass each morning with wide eyes. Some probably dreamed of joining the army one day. Others wisely decided farming looked considerably less exhausting. Neither choice was entirely free of hard work. Markets near Roman forts became wonderfully lively places. You might hear Latin spoken beside Celtic languages, Greek merchants bargaining with local craftsmen, North African traders unloading amphorae of olive oil, Spanish merchants offering cured ham. The empire gathered people together in remarkable ways. Food traveled alongside language, customs, and ideas. A simple evening meal sometimes reflected half a dozen different provinces, not through grand political plans, simply because people enjoy sharing good recipes. The officers occasionally invited one another to dinner. Their meals were certainly more elaborate, several courses instead of one. Better wine, fresh fish, imported spices, perhaps roasted birds stuffed with herbs. Nothing outrageous by aristocratic Roman standards. Still considerably more luxurious than the stew bubbling away in the soldiers' tents nearby. Yet even these finer meals relied upon the same roads, the same merchants, and the same harvests. The entire empire, from emperor to recruit, quietly depended upon successful farming. Nature remained the senior partner in every political arrangement. Meanwhile, ordinary soldiers continued improving their own cooking. Experience teaches quietly. After several years, a recruit who once struggled to bake edible bread could prepare an excellent loaf almost without thinking. He knew exactly how hot the fire should be, exactly how long to knead the dough, exactly when to turn it. These small skills rarely appeared in military records, yet they became part of everyday competence. A veteran carried more than scars and memories. He carried recipes. Around the evening fire, stories filled the time while dinner cooked. Not all of them were true. In fact, some became noticeably less true every time they were told. Someone claimed he had once seen a fish longer than a wagon. Another insisted he had marched for 3 days without sleeping. A third quietly mentioned that he personally knew someone who had met Julius Caesar's nephew's neighbor, or something equally impressive. The details tended to become rather flexible after a cup or two of diluted wine. Human beings have always enjoyed polishing a good story, even when the truth was already perfectly interesting. Sometimes the stories turned toward food itself. One soldier remembered his mother's vegetable soup. Another described fresh bread from his hometown. Someone from Spain praised the local olives. A recruit from Greece argued that no one baked better bread than his village. Immediately, someone from Italy objected. Friendly debates continued long into the evening. No clear winner ever emerged. Fortunately, everyone still had dinner. Cooking also created unexpected friendships. A young recruit uncertain of himself might learn from an older veteran. One demonstrated how to sharpen a knife properly. Another explained the quickest way to light damp firewood. Someone else quietly shared an extra piece of cheese with a homesick companion. History often remembers courage shown in battle. It less frequently remembers kindness shown over supper. Yet both helped keep an army together. Perhaps kindness lasted even longer. Occasionally musicians appeared in camp, nothing formal. A simple flute, a small lyre. Someone with a reasonably pleasant singing voice. After dinner, soft music drifted between the tents. Not every evening, only now and then. Enough to remind everyone that life contains something besides marching and drills. Even the hardest soldiers appreciated moments of peace, especially after a full stomach. As darkness deepened, guards quietly took their positions. The camp gradually settled. Cooking pots had been cleaned, leftover bread carefully stored. The fire burned lower. Above, the stars stretched across the sky exactly as they had for countless generations. A soldier lying outside his tent might recognize familiar constellations, the same stars his family saw hundreds of kilometers away. The same stars watched by merchants crossing the sea, farmers tending distant fields, children asleep in warm houses. Empires connected people through roads and laws. The night sky connected everyone else, without asking permission. Tomorrow would almost certainly bring another march, another meal prepared with patient hands, another evening around the fire. And although history remembers the Roman army for its discipline, its engineering, and its victories, perhaps its greatest achievement was something much quieter. For centuries, across mountains, forests, deserts, and distant frontiers, hundreds of thousands of ordinary people woke before sunrise, baked bread together, shared simple meals, looked after one another, and somehow kept one of history's largest empires moving forward. Not with grand banquets, not with endless luxury, but with flour, water, olive oil, hard work, and the comforting certainty that if all went well, there would be another warm meal waiting when the day's marching was finally done. By now, the rhythm of the Legion has become almost hypnotic. The days no longer stand apart from one another. Instead, they blend together like the gentle crackling of a campfire or the steady sound of boots on a Roman road. One sunrise follows another. One loaf of bread follows the next. One quiet supper slowly gives way to another evening beneath the stars. Perhaps this was exactly how the soldiers experienced time, not as great historical moments, but as countless ordinary days stitched together by familiar meals. If there was one thing the Roman army disliked, it was uncertainty. Food, therefore, became something almost sacred. Every sack of grain was counted, every barrel inspected, every shipment carefully recorded. Roman officials seemed to believe that if they wrote enough reports, reality would politely cooperate. Reality, of course, had other ideas. Ships still encountered storms, roads still flooded, mules still wandered away at remarkably inconvenient moments, because of course they did. The quartermasters lived in a world of endless numbers, How many soldiers? How many days? How many kilograms of wheat? How many barrels of olive oil? How much salt? How many spare millstones? It may not sound exciting. In fairness, it probably wasn't. Yet these calculations quietly decided whether an army remained healthy or hungry. History often crowns generals with glory. Quartermasters usually receive paperwork. Life can be strangely unfair. One remarkable feature of the Roman army was how standardized everything became. The cooking pots looked similar. The grain rations followed familiar measurements. The tents housed the same number of men. Even the ovens inside permanent forts often followed similar designs. The Romans loved systems. If something worked well once, they saw little reason to invent a completely different version. Consistency became almost an art form. This predictability brought comfort. Imagine arriving at a distant fort after weeks of marching. You've never visited this place before. The local language sounds unfamiliar. The weather feels different. Yet inside the walls, the ovens resemble the ones back home. The grain is distributed the same way. Dinner smells reassuringly familiar. Even on the edge of the empire, life retains little pieces of home. That must have meant more than official records could ever describe. Not every soldier came from Italy. In fact, many did not. As the centuries passed, recruits increasingly arrived from every province under Roman control. Britain, Gaul, Hispania, Thrace, Syria, North Africa. Each new recruit carried different traditions, different memories, different favorite foods. The Roman army quietly blended these cultures together. Someone learned a better way to prepare beans. Someone else introduced a new herb. Another shared a family recipe for vegetable stew. Empires often spread ideas as efficiently as they spread laws, sometimes far more pleasantly. Bread itself came in many forms. Some loaves were round, others flat. Some were coarse and heavy, others lighter, depending upon the flour available. Archaeologists have even discovered carbonized Roman loaves preserved beneath the ashes of Pompeii. Nearly 2,000 years later, they still show the marks where the dough was divided into slices before baking. It is an oddly moving sight. A simple loaf of bread, prepared by ordinary hands, frozen forever by extraordinary circumstances. History occasionally whispers through the smallest objects. The Roman kitchen contained surprisingly few tools. A knife, a pot, a ladle, a grinding stone, wooden bowls, simple spoons, nothing elaborate, no complicated machines, no shelves overflowing with specialized equipment. The meals depended far more upon patience than technology. Slow cooking over glowing coals demanded attention. There were no timers, only experience. The fire itself became the cook's closest companion. Firewood was another constant concern. Without fuel, there was no bread, no stew, no warm water. Soldiers collected wood whenever possible. Large forts stored considerable supplies before winter. Rain made everything more difficult. Wet wood smoked endlessly before finally catching. Every experienced cook knew the satisfaction of finding a few perfectly dry logs hidden beneath a shelter. Tiny victories deserve quiet appreciation. The Roman evening meal often became the calmest part of the day. Training had ended, tools had been put away, orders for tomorrow had already been given. Now there was only supper. Conversation drifted lazily around the fire. No one hurried. The stew would be ready when it was ready. Trying to rush it accomplished very little. Perhaps the Romans accidentally discovered one of history's oldest lessons. Some things simply cannot be hurried. Good bread, good soup, and peaceful evenings. Occasionally someone celebrated a birthday, not with enormous cakes covered in candles. That tradition lay far in the future. Instead, perhaps a slightly better meal, a little extra wine, friends offering warm wishes. Maybe someone produced a small honey cake purchased from a nearby market. Simple celebrations often leave the deepest memories, not because they are extravagant, because they are shared. The army also cared for its sick. Medical treatment in the ancient world could be imaginative. Some remedies genuinely helped. Others inspired optimism more than recovery. Fortunately, proper food remained one of the best medicines available. Warm broth, fresh bread, plenty of water, rest. Even Roman doctors understood that hungry patients recovered slowly, although they might also recommend a herbal mixture of rather mysterious origin. Medical science has traveled a long road since then. As soldiers grew older, food sometimes became one of the things they missed most after retirement. Not because military meals were luxurious, far from it, but because they became familiar. There is comfort in routine, comfort in knowing exactly how a loaf smells while baking, comfort in sharing the same evening fire with friends year after year. Even ordinary meals become precious once they belong to memory. Some veterans settled near the very forts where they had served. They married, started farms, opened taverns, became bakers, raised children who grew up watching retired legionaries discuss bread with astonishing seriousness. Old habits are difficult to abandon, especially habits repeated for 25 years. One imagines many family dinners quietly included the sentence, "This isn't quite how we used to make it in the army." Every generation has its experts. As the empire continued to grow, so too did its appetite. Millions of people depended upon reliable harvests. Cities required grain ships arriving almost daily. Soldiers depended upon warehouses that never seemed quite full enough. Farmers worked fields stretching toward distant horizons. Millers turned grain into flour. Bakers filled ovens before sunrise. Countless ordinary people, most of whom history never named, quietly kept the empire alive. Without them, no legion would march, no emperor would rule, no triumph would be celebrated. Civilizations, it turns out, rest upon remarkably humble foundations, usually flour. The camp grows quiet once more. The bowls have been emptied, the last crust of bread carefully saved for tomorrow. The fire has settled into glowing embers. A soft breeze moves gently through the tents. Somewhere nearby, a guard slowly walks the perimeter, his footsteps almost disappearing into the night. The soldiers sleep peacefully. Tomorrow promises another ordinary day, another careful distribution of grain, another loaf baked over glowing coals, another shared meal beneath an open sky. And perhaps that is the true story of what ancient Roman soldiers ate every day. Not endless feasts fit for emperors, not legendary banquets overflowing with exotic delicacies, but honest food, simple food. Food prepared by tired hands after long days of work, bread broken among friends, stew shared around quiet fires, meals that filled empty stomachs, strengthened weary bodies, and helped carry one of history's greatest armies across 3 continents, one peaceful day at a time. Another season slips quietly into the next. The leaves that once shaded the camp roads begin to turn golden. The evenings arrive a little earlier. The air carries that unmistakable hint of autumn, a reminder that even the largest empire in the ancient world could not negotiate with the changing seasons. The Roman army prepared accordingly. Summer was for campaigning, autumn was for gathering, winter was for enduring, and through every season one constant remained: the bread. Harvest time transformed the countryside. Fields rippled like golden waves beneath the breeze. Farmers moved methodically through the wheat with sickles in hand. Behind them came families collecting every fallen stalk. Nothing was wasted. A single ear of grain might seem insignificant. Multiply it by millions, however, and entire cities survived. The Romans understood this very well. To them, grain was not simply food, it was security, it was stability. It was, in many ways, the foundation of the empire itself. When the harvest was complete, wagons rolled slowly toward the granaries, oxen strained against heavy loads, the wheels creaked over dusty roads. Children ran alongside for a while before losing interest and chasing something far more exciting. Perhaps a butterfly, perhaps each other. Life continued around the machinery of empire, often blissfully unaware of how important these quiet journeys truly were. Every sack of wheat represented thousands of future meals. Inside the granaries, workers carefully inspected the grain. Moisture was the enemy. Rot was even worse. The buildings were designed to stay cool and dry, with raised floors allowing air to circulate beneath them. It was clever engineering, not particularly glamorous. No poet was likely to compose an epic about proper ventilation. Yet this quiet ingenuity kept food edible for months, sometimes years. The Romans had a remarkable talent for solving practical problems before they became disasters, at least most of the time. In the camp, preparations for winter also gathered pace. Extra firewood was stacked beneath shelters, cooking pots were repaired, blankets were inspected for holes, sandals received new leather straps, even the grain mills were checked. A cracked millstone could quickly become a serious inconvenience. Grinding enough flour by hand was already tiring. Doing it with broken equipment was an entirely different adventure, one that nobody volunteered for. Roman soldiers became experts at making do. If a handle broke, someone carved a new one. If a pot cracked, it might be patched. If bread turned out slightly burnt, it was eaten anyway. Waste was a luxury. Practicality ruled every corner of military life. Perhaps that explains why Roman camps often felt less like temporary armies and more like traveling workshops. Someone was always repairing something. Occasionally, a hunter returned with unexpected success. A wild boar, several rabbits, a handful of birds. These moments brought genuine excitement, not loud excitement, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing dinner would be slightly different tonight. The meat would be shared, perhaps roasted slowly over glowing coals, perhaps added to a large stew. For one evening, the familiar rhythm changed just enough to feel special. Tomorrow, of course, it would be back to bread. And no one seemed particularly offended by that. The officers sometimes organized modest feasts after important victories. Not the extravagant banquets held in Rome. Those belonged to senators and wealthy nobles with enough servants to lose track of them. Military feasts remained comparatively practical. More meat, better wine, fresh bread, cheese, olives, fruit, perhaps a sweet pastry if supplies allowed. Even these celebrations reflected Roman discipline: enjoy the meal, offer thanks, then return to work in the morning. The empire, after all, was unlikely to maintain itself. Some evenings, veterans entertained younger recruits with stories from distant campaigns, not always tales of battle. Often they remembered food: the rich olives of Hispania, the sweet dates of Syria, the excellent cheese from the mountains of Gaul, the fish markets along the coast of Greece. Memory has an amusing habit of attaching itself to meals. Ask someone about a journey, and sooner or later they will probably tell you what they ate. Apparently, this has been true for thousands of years. Travel exposed Roman soldiers to an astonishing variety of cultures. One month they might be eating barley porridge in Britain, the next wheat bread in Italy, later lentil stew in Judea. Different regions cooked differently, different spices, different vegetables, different breads. The soldiers adapted with surprising ease. Good food, after all, has a universal language. Even if everyone argues about the correct recipe, especially if everyone argues about the correct recipe. Around the campfire, recipes quietly spread from province to province. A recruit from Greece suggested adding herbs to the beans. Someone from North Africa introduced a different seasoning. A Spaniard recommended another way of roasting meat. No official order required this exchange. It happened naturally. Empires move armies. People move traditions. Sometimes the traditions last far longer. The Roman army also relied heavily on discipline during mealtimes. No one rushed to the front of the line. Food had to be distributed fairly. Arguments over rations were taken seriously. After all, fairness mattered. Nothing damaged morale faster than the suspicion that someone else had received a larger loaf of bread. Humans possess an extraordinary ability to estimate the size of another person's portion, especially when hungry. As darkness settled over the camp, the evening meal slowly came to an end. The bowls were scraped clean, the bread basket emptied, cooking pots were rinsed with precious water, ashes were carefully spread over the fire, only a few glowing embers remained. Nearby, someone quietly mended a torn cloak, another sharpened a knife, a third simply sat watching the flames, saying nothing at all. Not every silence needs filling. Sometimes after a long day's work, quiet company is enough. Beyond the camp walls, the countryside rested peacefully. Farmhouses glowed faintly in the distance, dogs barked somewhere far away. An owl called from the edge of the forest. The stars emerged one by one, unchanged by emperors, wars, or passing centuries. The soldiers looked up at the same constellations their grandparents had seen, the same ones we can still find today. There is something strangely comforting about that. Empires rise, empires fall, bread is baked, stars continue shining. And so another ordinary Roman day gently faded into night. Tomorrow would bring another careful count of grain sacks, another batch of dough mixed with water and salt, another shared meal beside a crackling fire. The food was simple, the routine was familiar, yet together these humble moments quietly sustained one of history's most remarkable armies, not through luxury or spectacle, but through patience, discipline, and the steady comfort of knowing that when the day's work was finally done, there would almost always be a warm loaf waiting to be broken among friends. By now, the years have begun to slip quietly past. The young recruit who once struggled to lift his pack has become the experienced veteran. His sandals are worn smooth from thousands of miles. His hands are rough from grinding grain, repairing equipment, and building camps. His hair carries a few strands of grey that were not there when he first swore his oath to Rome. He has become part of the routine, and the routine has become part of him. If someone asked him about the greatest battle he ever fought, he might tell an interesting story. If they asked what he remembered most clearly, however, the answer might be surprisingly simple. The smell of bread baking before sunrise, the sound of grain being poured into a wooden bowl, the warmth of a cooking fire after a cold march through rain. Memory has curious priorities. Grand victories often blur together. A familiar meal remains astonishingly clear. Roman military service lasted many years, long enough for boys to become middle-aged men, long enough for fashions in Rome to change several times, long enough for emperors to come and go. Some emperors ruled wisely, some ruled poorly, a few behaved in ways that continue to puzzle historians. Fortunately for the ordinary soldier, bread generally cared very little who happened to be sitting on the imperial throne. Someone still had to grind the wheat. Someone still had to light the oven. The empire continued because ordinary people kept doing ordinary work. Letters from home arrived whenever circumstances allowed. One soldier learned that his younger brother had married. Another discovered his father had planted a new vineyard. Someone else heard that the family mule had once again escaped through the same broken fence. Apparently, even 2,000 years ago, certain mules possessed a lifelong commitment to inconvenience. The soldiers laughed softly. Life back home continued without them. That realization was comforting and melancholy in equal measure. The camp itself became almost like a second home. The same companions, the same fire, the same battered cooking pot, the same old jokes repeated often enough to become traditions. One veteran always insisted that the porridge tasted better 20 years ago. No one believed him, but everyone expected him to say it anyway. Every group develops its familiar characters. The Roman army was no exception. Sometimes new recruits arrived. They looked nervous. Their equipment felt awkward. Their boots were still stiff. The veterans watched with quiet amusement, not cruelly, simply because they remembered being exactly the same. Before long, the newcomers would learn how to bake bread without burning it. They would learn where to collect the driest firewood. They would learn which herbs improved a simple stew. Knowledge passed gently from one generation of soldiers to the next, not through grand lectures, through ordinary evenings around the fire. Cooking became a kind of education. An older soldier showed a recruit how to judge the heat of an oven by holding his hand near the opening. Another explained how much water to add when the flour seemed unusually dry. Someone demonstrated how to store grains so mice found it less appealing. These were small lessons, yet they made daily life easier. Civilizations are often built from countless tiny pieces of shared knowledge. Most never appear in history books. The army doctors also understood the importance of diet. When a soldier recovered from illness, he might first receive light broth, soft bread, warm water, simple foods that were easy to digest. No miraculous cures, just careful nourishment. Ancient medicine sometimes wandered into strange territory, but even then, good food remained one of its most reliable treatments. A bowl of hot soup has comforted humanity for an impressively long time. Some soldiers developed impressive baking skills. Had history unfolded slightly differently, They might have opened successful bakeries after retirement. Instead, they became unofficial experts within the camp. When bread emerged perfectly browned from the oven, everyone knew exactly who had prepared it. His reputation spread quietly through the legion. Not every hero carried a sword. Some carried flour. Religious festivals occasionally interrupted the routine. The camp might receive extra wine, a special meal, perhaps roasted meat shared among the entire unit. Offerings were made to the gods. Prayers were spoken. For a little while, the ordinary schedule softened. Even disciplined armies benefit from moments of celebration. Afterward, of course, life returned to normal. The grain still needed grinding. The ovens still needed heating. Tradition waited patiently. As the years passed, the veteran noticed small changes. New commanders arrived. Different recruits joined the ranks. Roads improved. Forts expanded. The empire itself shifted almost imperceptibly. Yet every evening, somewhere inside the camp, someone still mixed flour with water. Someone still stirred a pot of beans. Someone still sliced fresh bread while friends gathered nearby. Certain routines outlast almost everything else. Eventually, thoughts of retirement became more frequent. The veteran imagined a small farm, perhaps an olive grove, maybe a vineyard, a quiet house with a proper bed. No trumpets before sunrise, no endless inspections, no one shouting because a shield had not been polished quite enough. The dream grew clearer every year. Still, when that day finally arrived, he suspected he might miss certain things. Not the marches, certainly not the winter rain, but perhaps the evenings, the shared meals, the familiar voices around the fire. Life has a curious way of making even difficult times seem gentle in memory. One final night settled over the camp before another ordinary morning. The fire burned low. Only glowing coals remained. The stars stretched silently across the sky exactly as they had for countless generations before Rome, and as they would long after the empire itself had faded into history. The veteran took one last piece of bread. He broke it carefully, shared half with the young recruit sitting beside him. No speech was needed. None would have improved the moment. Some traditions speak for themselves. The recruit accepted the bread with a quiet smile. Tomorrow he would help bake the next loaf. Years from now, he might pass that same habit to another young soldier. And so the simple rhythm continued, not through famous emperors or legendary battles, but through flour, water, fire, friendship, and the countless peaceful evenings that quietly sustained the Roman army across centuries. Perhaps that is the true answer to our question. What did ancient Roman soldiers eat every day? They ate coarse bread, warm porridge, lentil stews, onions, olives, cheese, dried fruit, salted meat when fortune allowed, and fresh food whenever the land provided it. But they also shared something less tangible: routine, community, patience, the quiet comfort of sitting beside familiar faces after a long day's work. History often remembers the victories. The soldiers probably remembered dinner. And as our own fire slowly fades into glowing embers, we can leave the Roman camp exactly as we found it: peaceful, orderly, and gently settling into another quiet night, where tomorrow's bread is already waiting somewhere inside a sack of grain, ready for another ordinary dawn.